In the quiet heart of St. Mary Mead, where roses bloom over secrets long forgotten, an old estate awakens to whispers of guilt and retribution. Beneath the calm of afternoon tea and the scent of spring lilac, human frailty stirs once more, love disguised as vengeance, and truth buried under years of silence. Miss Marple, ever gentle yet unerring, will soon uncover how even the kindest hearts may hide the darkest debts. Where in the world are you tuning in from today? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us return to Greystone Park, where spring and truth are about to bloom again. It was a mild afternoon in early spring, and the vicarage garden shimmered with pale sunlight filtering through budding trees. Miss Marple, seated comfortably with her knitting, listened with polite amusement as Mrs. Clement spoke of parish matters, while the Reverend turned the pages of his sermon notes with distracted gentility. The conversation flowed easily until Mrs. Clement, lowering her voice, mentioned that Greystone Park had at last been sold to a retired colonel and his young wife. The name stirred faint memories, and Miss Marple, ever attentive to village tides, raised her eyes with mild curiosity. There was something curiously familiar in the rhythm of that name. Greystone, like an echo that had once disturbed the peace of St. Mary Mead. The Reverend's niece, Sylvia Trent, who had arrived only the previous evening from London, leaned forward with a faint tremor of excitement. She worked, it seemed, as secretary to the new owner of Greystone Park, and had come down for a brief rest. Yet her voice betrayed unease as she spoke of the caretaker, old Mr. Jolly, who had been found drowned in the ornamental pond scarcely a week after the colonel's arrival. Her words came in nervous bursts, half whispers and glances toward the window, as though the tranquil vicarage garden might somehow be listening. There was fear beneath her composure, and Miss Marple quietly noted it. As the tea cooled and shadows lengthened, Sylvia grew bolder, compelled by the unspoken attention of her small audience. She recounted tales whispered among the servants, of a curse upon Greystone, and a locked north tower from which ghostly lights were said to flicker on certain nights. The villagers spoke of a tragedy long past, a soldier's death, a lost inheritance, a family line extinguished. The tower, Sylvia said, had remained sealed ever since. The vicar smiled indulgently, but Miss Marple's fingers paused mid-stitch. Superstition, she knew, often masked something far more human. Miss Marple's expression was one of mild, almost grandmotherly interest, but her mind, sharp as ever, turned over each word Sylvia spoke. She noticed how the girl hesitated when mentioning the colonel, yet spoke with surprising certainty about the hour she last saw him. Such precision seldom came without reason. Nor did Miss Marple overlook the nervous way Sylvia's hands clasped together when Mrs. Clement innocently remarked upon the tragedy of the drowning. People often revealed more in silence than in speech, she reflected. There was unease in Sylvia's every gesture, not only fear, but guilt of some unacknowledged kind. By evening, word of the conversation had drifted from the vicarage to the post office and beyond. St. Mary Mead, that bastion of gentle gossip, buzzed with speculation. Greystone's new owners, the mysterious death of the caretaker, and talk of the cursed tower were upon every tongue. Some spoke of ghostly retribution, others hinted at darker debts. Miss Marple heard it all with quiet amusement, though she could not help feeling that something beneath the embroidery of rumour rang disturbingly true. As twilight gathered over the hedgerows, the maid entered the parlour with an envelope upon a small tray. It was addressed, in a firm military hand, to Miss Jane Marple, Vicarage Lane. The Reverend examined the seal, remarking on its elegance, while Miss Marple opened it with calm curiosity. Inside lay a brief note of invitation from Colonel Harwood himself, requesting the pleasure of her company for tea at Greystone Park. The old lady smiled faintly as she folded the letter. In her experience, an invitation so unexpected rarely came without a story waiting to be uncovered. Miss Marple's small carriage turned into the long, curving drive that led to Greystone Park. The estate, once stately, now bore the weary dignity of something outliving its splendour. Ivy crept possessively over the stone facade, while the gardens, once carefully tended, hinted at neglect, beds of roses struggling against weeds, and gravel paths losing their edges to moss. Yet, There was a curious melancholy charm about the place, as though it carried its history with quiet pride. To Miss Marple's observant mind, such decay was seldom merely the work of time. Houses, like people, often revealed the temperaments of those who lived within. As she approached the front steps, a faint sound of the wind through the trees seemed to whisper across the stillness, a sound neither friendly nor hostile, but full of remembrance. She had known estates like this before, she thought, where peace appeared to reign only because too much had already been said long ago. The front door opened almost before Miss Marple had time to lift the brass knocker. Colonel Harwood stood there himself, tall, silver-haired, and possessing that particular brand of military politeness which feels simultaneously sincere and defensive. His handshake was firm, yet there was something curiously mechanical about it, as though practised by habit rather than inclination. He thanked her for accepting the invitation, expressed his regret for the recent unpleasantness, and ushered her in with courteous precision. His words were perfectly chosen, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. Miss Marple noticed with quiet interest how he hesitated before mentioning his late caretaker, a hesitation that spoke not of grief, but of uncertainty. Pride and weariness seemed to dwell together in him, as though the discipline of command had become armour against something he did not wish to face. As he guided her toward the drawing-room, Miss Marple reflected that soldiers carried their ghosts differently from civilians, not in memories of the battlefield, but in silences around the breakfast table. Celia Harwood entered the room with a brightness too quickly summoned to be natural. She was delicate, graceful, and quite evidently nervous, the kind of woman who smiled because silence frightened her. Her voice fluttered pleasantly over trivialities, yet beneath the charm there was the unmistakable edge of fear. Miss Marple, taking her seat by the fire, observed the quick movement of Celia's hands as she poured the tea, each gesture too carefully measured as though rehearsed. Her eyes darted occasionally towards the door, betraying an unspoken apprehension of who might enter next. It was clear she adored her husband, or rather, the idea of him, yet there lingered a subtle distance between them, like a shadow falling across sunlight. Miss Marple, whose experience of human frailty was as old as the roses in her garden, understood such looks. They were not signs of a love unfulfilled, but of conscience uneased. Mrs. Bragg, the housekeeper, made her appearance soon after, with the air of a woman who considered the running of Greystone Park her life's purpose, and perhaps its burden. Her courtesy was impeccable, but her gaze, sharp and assessing, moved from her master to Miss Marple with quiet suspicion. She addressed no one directly unless required, her words clipped and measured. Yet Miss Marple, glancing up from her teacup, noted how Mrs. Bragg's expression softened for an instant when it rested upon Celia, not with affection, but with pity. It was the sort of pity that comes from knowledge too long endured. There was bitterness in the woman's tone, yet loyalty too, and the kind born of years of unspoken endurance. Miss Marple had met her kind before, women who knew more than they dared tell, who watched tragedy build quietly in households while remaining outwardly obedient to duty. When Dr. Linton arrived, his calm, assured manner brought a semblance of composure to the room. A man of middle years and deliberate speech, he carried the quiet authority of one accustomed to difficult situations. Miss Marple recognised at once the type, sympathetic but guarded, a professional observer of human suffering, who seldom allowed emotion to cloud judgment. His conversation was polite, yet his eyes betrayed curiosity. Seated near him, Arthur Jolly Jr., the late caretaker's son, remained silent for most of the visit. His sullen demeanour and tightly folded arms spoke of anger poorly contained. The young man had inherited his father's broad shoulders, but none of his reputed good nature. Miss Marple noticed how his gaze followed Celia Harwood, not with admiration, but something more dangerous, resentment. When the Colonel addressed him, Arthur's replies were curt, his tone edged with defiance. Miss Marple, always attentive to the nuances of human manner, thought quietly that grief did not always wear black. Sometimes it wore bitterness instead. Conversation at tea proceeded with all the grace expected of an English household, though every word seemed to rest on an undercurrent of unease. The Colonel spoke of village affairs and the weather with mechanical good humour, while Celia nodded dutifully beside him, her smile trembling slightly each time his eyes met hers, Mrs. Bragg interrupted once or twice to correct a trivial detail, a habit that drew a faint frown from the Colonel. Dr. Linton, ever tactful, steered the talk toward harmless topics, but even he seemed conscious of the strain beneath the politeness. Miss Marple, who had perfected the art of appearing vague while observing everything, noted several things of interest. The faint trembling of Celia's teacup, the Colonel's quick glance toward the window whenever footsteps passed outside, and Mrs. Bragg's unwillingness to look directly at Arthur Jolly. These were not the gestures of mourning, she reflected, but of concealment. When Mrs. Bragg sharply contradicted Celia about some minor matter, Miss Marple saw a flicker of triumph cross the woman's face, and that, she thought, was worth remembering. It was only as the afternoon waned that Miss Marple's attention was drawn, quite naturally, to the subject of the house itself. Celia, anxious to seem conversational, mentioned that parts of Greystone remained unfit for visitors, particularly the North Tower, which had been sealed for many years. The Colonel dismissed the topic curtly, claiming it was unsafe due to disrepair. Yet Miss Marple, ever sensitive to tone, detected a note of irritation rather than concern in his voice. Towers, she reflected, were seldom locked for structural reasons. It was usually the contents that required guarding, not the walls. Her eyes drifted briefly to a portrait on the wall. A young officer in uniform, the paint cracked by time. Beneath the smile of youth lay an unspoken melancholy. Captain Raymond Greystone, Celia explained softly. The name lingered like a chill in the air. Miss Marple thought that some houses, much like people, kept their wounds covered with paint and silence. As Miss Marple rose to take her leave, twilight had already deepened into the quiet grey of evening. Colonel Harwood accompanied her to the door, his civility impeccable to the last. Yet, as she stepped outside, a faint sound caught her ear, the distant wavering notes of music. Her gaze lifted instinctively toward the North Tower, where a narrow window glimmered faintly against the darkening sky. For a fleeting moment she thought she discerned the outline of a figure standing there, unmoving. When she turned back, the Colonel was already closing the door, too quickly, she thought, for a man with nothing to hide. In the days that followed Miss Marple's visit to Greystone, unease settled upon St. Mary Mead like an early frost. Gossip drifted through the lanes, finding its way into every parlour and post office conversation. There were reports of strange flickering lights in the North Tower, and the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps along the garden paths long after midnight. Some swore they had heard a man's voice murmuring in the wind, others insisted it was only the trees. Miss Marple, never one to dismiss superstition lightly, listened with her habitual serenity, knowing that fear often served as a convenient veil for human mischief. She noted the curious consistency of these tales, how they began, almost uniformly, with servants' talk from Greystone. Fear, she reflected, spread far faster than truth, and in villages like theirs it became a form of entertainment. Yet beneath the murmurs of haunting and vengeance, there was a note of something more substantial, guilt perhaps, still stirring after years of being buried. Sylvia Trent came to Miss Marple one damp afternoon, pale and visibly distressed. The young woman's usual brisk composure had given way to a trembling anxiety. She confessed in hesitant phrases that Colonel Harwood had lately been receiving anonymous notes, each signed with the ominous line, "The debt of Greystone is not paid." The handwriting, she said, was unfamiliar, slanting and uneven, almost as though written by an unsteady hand. Sylvia spoke quickly, her eyes fixed upon her gloves, as if afraid they might betray her. The Colonel had dismissed the letters as nonsense, yet his manner since receiving them had altered noticeably. He was curt with servants, restless in sleep, and strangely insistent that the North Tower remain locked. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her mind quietly fitting this revelation into the growing pattern. The word debt caught her attention most of all. It was seldom used in jest and never without history. When Sylvia rose to leave, Miss Marple gently asked whether anyone else knew of the letters. Sylvia hesitated too long before answering no. That hesitation told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. That night, as she sat by her parlour fire, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered back many years. The debt of Greystone. The phrase had a haunting familiarity. There had been, she recalled, a story whispered during the last war about an officer named Greystone, young, proud, and ruinously honest. He had been accused of embezzling regimental funds, a charge that had driven him to disgrace and ultimately to his death. Yet those who had known him spoke of another man, a senior officer of impeccable reputation, who had benefited from his fall. The name eluded her for a moment. Then it came, unbidden. Harwood. She remembered reading of it in an old newspaper tucked inside a copy of the Times. Such coincidences rarely occurred by accident. The past, in Miss Marple's experience, was a rather stubborn thing. It had a way of finding its echo in the present, no matter how deeply one tried to bury it. On the following morning, Miss Marple took a quiet walk to the churchyard, a place she often found both peaceful and revealing. The headstones stood in uneven rows, some leaning as though weary of keeping their vigil. Her sharp eyes moved slowly over the inscriptions until one name caught her attention: Captain Raymond Greystone. The words beneath were simple, yet heavy with unspoken tragedy. Died by his own hand, 1919. She stood for a while in silence, her gloved hands resting lightly upon her walking stick. Suicide, in her long experience, was rarely so straightforward. Near the grave, the earth had sunk slightly as if time itself had bowed in grief. Someone, she noticed, still tended the plot. The flowers were fresh, the weeds carefully cleared. Who, she wondered, came to honour a man so long dead and disgraced? As she turned to leave, the church bell struck the hour, its sound rolling across the park beyond. The Tower of Greystone loomed faintly through the mist, and Miss Marple's mind, ever methodical, began to connect the living with the dead. There were debts, indeed, and some, it seemed, were still being collected. Later that day, Miss Marple found Mrs. Bragg in the church arranging flowers before the altar. The housekeeper's broad shoulders and severe manner gave her an air of authority, even in the hush of sacred space. Miss Marple spoke gently of the grave she had just visited, mentioning Captain Greystone's name. Mrs. Bragg's hands froze over the lilies, her face paling almost imperceptibly. "Best leave the past alone, miss," she muttered, her voice roughened by age and something deeper, regret perhaps. "Some sins never leave a house." It was an odd phrase, delivered not as superstition but as certainty. Miss Marple replied with mild civility, but inwardly she weighed the words carefully. A sin that lingered, a debt unpaid, a house that refused peace, all pointed not to the supernatural but to human will. As she walked away, the air behind her seemed heavy with unspoken things. Mrs. Bragg, watching from the doorway, crossed herself quickly. Not from piety, Miss Marple thought, but from fear. By the end of the week, the whole of St. Mary Mead was caught up in the affair of Greystone. Tales grew wilder with every retelling. Some said the Colonel's late servant had been seen walking near the pond at midnight. Others insisted that ghostly cries came from the tower itself. Such tales, Miss Marple knew, served their purpose. They distracted attention from the living. The Colonel, it was whispered, had become increasingly erratic, keeping to his study and sending his wife away on errands. The servants were uneasy, claiming they found their master's papers scattered as if in agitation. Dr. Linton, discreet as ever, said only that the Colonel suffered from strain, though his face betrayed deeper concern. Miss Marple watched the pattern form as she always did. Fear on one side, silence on the other, and a thread of truth running quietly between them. In every household she visited she heard the same refrain. The debt of Greystone. The phrase had acquired the rhythm of legend, but Miss Marple knew better. Legends were only truth remembered imperfectly, and this one, she suspected, was on the verge of completing itself. The following morning, news spread swiftly through the village that Colonel Harwood was dead. It had happened, they said, at breakfast. The family had gathered as usual, though little about the household could be called usual now. The Colonel had been in better spirits, even jesting faintly about the villagers' gossip. He had raised his cup of coffee, taken a single sip, and then, without warning, stiffened, his hand clutching at the table's edge. Dr. Linton, summoned at once, could only confirm what was already clear. The cause, he said, appeared to be poisoning, though the manner of it remained uncertain. Miss Marple, hearing the news, sat very still. The rhythm of the affair had shifted. The the past had claimed its second victim. Yet she felt no satisfaction in having foreseen it, only the quiet certainty that the time for observation had ended and that of judgment had begun. The debts of Greystone were at last being paid, but by whose hand, she wondered, and to what end? Dr. Linton's manner, always calm and deliberate, carried a new gravity as he addressed those gathered in the study. His words were measured, his tone restrained, yet they struck like a hammer against stone. Colonel Harwood, he said, had died from strychnine poisoning. The symptoms were unmistakable: the muscular convulsions, the asphyxiation, the fixed expression of horror. Yet the question of how the poison had entered his system remained unresolved. The coffee, the milk, even the sugar had been tested, all yielding nothing conclusive. The teacups, too, were free of residue. It seemed almost impossible, a murder committed in plain sight, yet without a trace of means. Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively by the hearth, observed that impossibility was often merely the word people used for cleverness. She watched Celia Harwood closely, noting how her trembling intensified at the mention of poison. The Colonel's death, it appeared, had surprised even those who might have wished him ill. Death by strychnine was rarely accidental, Miss Marple reflected. It required foresight, opportunity, and above all intent. By mid-afternoon, Inspector Craddock had arrived from Melchester, a man of sound judgment and quiet temperament, with a kindly regard for Miss Marple's peculiar talents. He entered, the investigation not with bluster, but with a sense of restrained curiosity, recognizing that in such households truth seldom wore its proper face. After the formalities were concluded, Craddock spoke with Miss Marple in low tones, expressing his appreciation for her assistance, if she would be so good. She in turn merely smiled, her knitting needles moving with rhythmic calm. Craddock, accustomed to her manner, understood that the needles did not indicate idleness. Together they examined the initial reports, the lack of external tampering, the unmarked bottle of sleeping draught, the confusion among servants. Strychnine, Craddock remarked, is a devilish substance, difficult to conceal and impossible to forget. Miss Marple murmured something about human nature being much the same. She was thinking not of poison, but of fear, the kind that creeps upon people who have begun to realize that death, once near, may come again. Celia Harwood's grief, when at last it was displayed, came in a torrent of tears that seemed to lack true conviction. She spoke too quickly, too fluently, her lamentations falling into patterns of speech more suited to a drawing-room tragedy than a bereavement. Her face was pale, her hands dramatically pressed against her temples, and her voice rose in what might have been mistaken for anguish were it not so carefully measured. Miss Marple, who had observed grief in all its forms, from the wordless stupor of shock to the brittle poise of self-restraint, found Celia's performance altogether curious. What drew her attention most, however, was not the woman's words but her silences. When Inspector Craddock mentioned the Colonel's final moments, Celia's eyes darted instinctively towards the window, as though she sought escape, and when asked whether her husband had any enemies, she replied with suspicious haste, "None at all." That, Miss Marple thought, was rarely true of any man, least of all one who had bought another man's ruined estate. Grief might explain tears, but fear explained precision. And Celia Harwood, beneath her trembling hands and fluttering lashes, was most certainly afraid. It was Arthur Jolly Jr. who first broke the solemn composure of the investigation. The young man's bitterness, long suppressed, erupted like a storm across the drawing-room. His father's death, he declared, had been dismissed too easily, and now justice had turned to claim another victim. He accused Celia Harwood openly, his voice thick with anger. She had motive, he insisted. The Colonel's wealth, the property, the freedom she had secretly desired. His words shocked the company, though not Miss Marple, who watched his outburst with the quiet sympathy reserved for those who mistake resentment for reason. Inspector Craddock intervened, demanding evidence, but Arthur had none save his own conviction. Miss Marple noted the tremor in his hands, not of fear, but of desperation. Such anger, she thought, came not merely from grief but from guilt, the sort that festers when one has played too close to danger. She glanced toward Mrs. Bragg, who stood rigid by the door, her expression curiously unreadable. In such households, truth often wore the face of insolence and innocence, the mask of outrage. 5. The Search of the Colonel's Study, 240 words. Inspector Craddock, methodical as ever, ordered a thorough search of the Colonel's study, a task conducted under Miss Marple's mild yet penetrating observation. The late Colonel's papers were found in disarray, his desk drawers locked, but easily opened with the assistance of Mrs. Bragg, who produced the keys from her apron pocket with a hint of reluctance. Letters, ledgers, and military correspondence lay in untidy heaps, suggesting recent agitation rather than long neglect. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted one detail the constables might have missed: a single ring of dust on the mahogany surface where an object, perhaps a small box or glass, had recently stood. It had been removed carefully, not hastily. Craddock meanwhile examined a stack of sealed envelopes, none remarkable in themselves, until one slipped free and revealed a key bound with faded ribbon. Etched faintly upon it was a single word: Tower. A hush fell over the room. The North Tower, long sealed and steeped in village legend, had suddenly become part of the living puzzle. Miss Marple folded her hands. Locked rooms, she thought, were rarely as secure as those who feared them believed. The dead had no secrets to guard, but the living often did, and this key, she suspected, had already opened more than one door. The hours following the discovery of the key were heavy with unease. The drawing-room, once a place of genteel repose, seemed now a stage upon which each soul performed under invisible scrutiny. Celia Harwood sat pale and silent, her cup untouched before her. Dr. Linton, standing by the hearth, spoke in tones too calm to be sincere, while Arthur Jolly lurked near the window, his eyes smouldering with resentment. Even Mrs. Bragg, whose manner usually combined duty with disdain, appeared subdued, though her glances towards Celia were far from kind. Miss Marple, knitting serenely, listened to the overlapping murmur of guilt and self-preservation. Every remark seemed carefully chosen, every silence more eloquent than words. The subject of the North Tower, once forbidden, lingered in every unspoken thought. "Strange," said Dr. Linton at last, "how some rooms seem to hold misfortune." Miss Marple's needles paused only for a moment before resuming their rhythm. Misfortune, she reflected, seldom resided in rooms. It resided in hearts, and the heart that feared exposure most would, inevitably, reveal itself first. That night St. Mary Mead lay shrouded in stillness, yet Greystone Park did not sleep. From the vicarage garden, Miss Marple, who had taken her customary late tea, noticed a faint wavering light glimmering from the North Tower window, a light that should not, by all accounts, have been there. Her mind, ever orderly, considered the possibilities: superstition, mischief, or guilt. None were pleasant, though all were plausible. At dawn, word spread that the tower door, sealed for decades, had been found unlocked, and upon its threshold the melted remains of a candle. No one in the house would admit to lighting it. Celia's hands trembled as she denied any knowledge, and Arthur Jolly's denial was too eager to be believed. Miss Marple said nothing, though her eyes grew thoughtful. Darkness, she reflected, often invited people to reveal their truest selves, and in the lonely hours before daylight the dead and the living sometimes conspired, not in haunting but in memory. The candle in the tower had burned for someone, and Miss Marple intended to discover for whom. The unlocking of the North Tower came with a peculiar solemnity, as though the house itself were exhaling after decades of restraint. Miss Marple stood beside Inspector Craddock, while the constable turned the heavy key, the one marked Tower, and the mechanism groaned reluctantly, releasing a stale breath of air thick with the scent of neglect. Dust spiraled upward in slow, accusing swirls, disturbed for the first time in years. No one spoke. The sound of the hinges was the only intrusion upon the silence, and even Craddock's usually firm voice softened, as though aware they were trespassing upon something sacred. Miss Marple, peering into the dimness, reflected that rooms long sealed often preserved not ghosts, but guilt. The tower, like a heart long closed against confession, yielded at last, and she wondered whose memories had been entombed within it. The inspector gestured for her to follow. "Age," Miss Marple murmured, "is not the same as peace." Sometimes, Inspector, what lingers longest does so because it was never truly laid to rest. Inside the tower the air was thick, oppressive, and strangely motionless, as though it had never known the touch of spring. The heavy curtains drooped like forgotten sentinels, and each surface bore the pale shroud of time. Miss Marple's eyes, accustomed to quiet observation, traced small details that others might have missed, a faint glimmer of wax upon the floorboards, the fragile curl of smoke that still clung to the air, and a pattern of tiny footprints pressed lightly into the dust. They were not the marks of a man's boots, but the soft indentations of a slender shoe. A woman had been here, and recently. She glanced at Craddock, who had not yet noticed. His attention was fixed on the faded portraits that lined the wall, ancestral faces with stern expressions and melancholy eyes. Miss Marple regarded them thoughtfully. Time, she knew, preserved everything: resentment, shame, and sometimes proof. As she bent to inspect a faint trail of melted wax, she wondered whose conscience had driven them here in secret to light a candle among the ruins of memory. In the far corner stood an object half concealed beneath a moth-eaten sheet, a large military trunk, the brass dull with age. Craddock brushed away the dust to reveal the faintly engraved initials, R.G., the letters just discernible in the tarnish. Miss Marple, who never believed in coincidences, felt a quiet thrill of recognition. "Captain Raymond Greystone," she murmured. The name had haunted her since that day in the churchyard. The lock, though rusted, yielded with little resistance, as though the trunk itself had grown weary of keeping its secrets. Inside, the smell of old paper and decay mingled with something faintly personal, a trace of pipe tobacco perhaps, or lavender once used to guard against moths. Neatly folded uniforms lay within, the fabric yellowed and fragile. Beneath them, wrapped in oilskin, was a collection of personal items, a leather-bound journal, a pair of medals, and at the bottom a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To whom it may concern." Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the envelope. Objects, she often said, retain the emotions of those who touched them. The weight of this one was heavy indeed, not from the ink it bore, but from the remorse it contained. The trunk's true revelation lay not in the medals or papers of service, but in a small wooden box hidden beneath the false bottom. Within it, neatly tied with a black ribbon faded by years, lay a sheaf of letters, their edges browned, their writing faint, but still legible. Miss Marple untied the ribbon with the delicacy one reserves for wounds long scarred. The letters were written in a steady soldier's hand, filled with words of loyalty, friendship, and growing despair. They were addressed to C.H., initials which Miss Marple recognised immediately: Colonel Harwood. The correspondence spanned the final year of the war, each letter revealing a man sinking further into disillusionment. The last few carried a tone of desperation. "You have left me to bear the blame," one read, "and still I hope that justice will one day find you." Miss Marple replaced the papers gently, aware that she was handling not just letters, but evidence of a life unjustly condemned. A man's ruin, she reflected, was sometimes less tragic than another's silence about it. The black ribbon had preserved not affection, but guilt, and guilt, as she well knew, rarely stayed buried forever. It took only a few letters to piece together the story that had shaped both Greystone Park and its new master's conscience. Captain Greystone had been accused of embezzling regimental funds, a crime that carried disgrace worse than death for a soldier of his kind. Yet in these letters, the truth was quietly, inexorably laid bare. Colonel Harwood, then the commanding officer, had diverted the funds himself, using the younger man's loyalty as a shield. When discovery loomed, it was Greystone who faced the inquiry. His honour, pride, and youth were sacrificed to preserve another man's reputation. Miss Marple read the lines slowly, pausing at the final one. "You cannot cleanse what you will not confess." The handwriting grew shakier with each letter until it ended abruptly, the last sheet smudged by what might have been water or tears. She folded the letters with quiet precision, understanding now why the colonel had bought the estate he had once condemned to ruin. The purchase had not been pride, but penance. Harwood had sought to bury his guilt within these walls, yet guilt, like ivy, always finds a way to grow again. As the discovery settled over them, Inspector Craddock paced thoughtfully, while Miss Marple sat beside the trunk, her expression contemplative rather than triumphant. "He bought the place to make amends," she said softly. "A man can pay debts with money, Inspector, but conscience collects its own interest." Craddock frowned, unable to reconcile remorse with murder. Miss Marple, however, saw no contradiction. The Colonel's death, she thought, had been the final instalment of a debt long overdue, yet someone had ensured that debt was paid in blood rather than repentance. She recalled the candle wax, the footprints, signs of a visitor to the tower. Whoever had come here knew this history and feared its revelation. Perhaps they had sought to destroy the evidence, or perhaps they had come to remind the Colonel of what he could no longer silence. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Celia Harwood, whose unease had deepened since the discovery of the tower key. Fear of scandal was a powerful thing, especially for those who lived in comfort upon the misfortunes of others. The dead, Miss Marple reflected, might forgive, but the living rarely did. The constables had gone, and still Miss Marple lingered, unwilling to leave the tower's strange, oppressive silence. Her gaze returned to the faint trail of wax upon the boards and the tiny footprints in the dust. She stooped, her gloved fingers brushing lightly against the prints. The spacing was close, the impression shallow, the steps of someone light, nervous, and moving quickly. A woman, certainly, and not long ago. The pattern of the wax confirmed it. The candle had burned for less than an hour. On the window-sill she found a small smear of mud, still faintly damp, bearing the imprint of a delicate heel. The evidence, though slight, told her more than any confession could. Someone had entered in darkness, seeking not discovery but closure, perhaps to destroy the letters, or to read them one final time. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her expression one of quiet sadness. Secrets, she thought, had a peculiar way of leading their keepers to ruin. A single drop of wax can reveal more than a page of words, and she knew, with the certainty of instinct, that the one who feared this truth most was still within the house. That evening, as twilight surrendered to night, Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, her knitting untouched upon her lap. Across the hearth, Celia Harwood knelt by the fire, her face pale in the flickering light. In her hands was a letter, the paper fragile and yellowed, the writing bold and unmistakable, R.G. The initials seemed almost to glow in the reflection of the flames. Miss Marple did not speak. She had no need to. The sound of the paper crackling was eloquent enough. Celia's expression was not one of malice, but of weary resignation, the look of someone surrendering to inevitability. When the letter had turned to ash, she rose, her composure restored, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was soft and grave. "It is never wise, my dear, to burn what one does not understand." Celia's lips parted in protest, then closed again. In that moment, Miss Marple saw both guilt and relief flicker across her face, the strange peace that follows destruction. As the embers dimmed, Miss Marple thought of the candle in the tower and the ashes in the hearth. Fire, it seemed, had become the chosen language of remorse at Greystone Park. In St. Mary Mead, the post office was the very pulse of village life, a place where truth and rumour were exchanged, with equal conviction. Miss Marple, posting a modest parcel of wool, listened with apparent detachment as Mrs. Price leaned confidentially across the counter. Celia Harwood, she declared, had been seen meeting Arthur Jolly by the pond on more than one occasion, and always at dusk. Such meetings, Mrs. Price hinted, were not the sort conducted in innocence. Miss Marple murmured her polite disbelief, though her eyes held a distant gleam of thought. Celia's nervous composure, her faintly pleading glances, these perhaps held a meaning now clearer than before. Yet Miss Marple never allowed gossip to serve as evidence. She regarded it merely as raw material, awaiting refinement. People spoke most freely, she reflected, when they believed themselves harmless, and sometimes the words of a busybody carried more truth than intent. As she left with her parcel tucked neatly beneath her arm, Miss Marple thought that affairs of the heart, particularly when tainted with fear, had a curious way of intertwining themselves with affairs of death. Later that afternoon, Dr. Linton called upon Miss Marple, his manner grave but not unkind. He spoke with the weary resignation of a man who had kept confidences too long. Colonel Harwood, he revealed, had been gravely unwell for months, his heart weakened by years of strain. He might have lived another year, the doctor said softly, had he chosen peace over pride. There was more. Only a few weeks before his death, the colonel had summoned him as witness to a new will, one leaving the bulk of his estate to his wife. It was a gesture of reconciliation, perhaps, or atonement. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression unreadable. Such changes, she knew, seldom came without complication. The doctor hesitated before adding that Mrs. Harwood had appeared distressed when signing the papers, as though uncertain of her own right to them. She trembled, he said, as if the pen were heavier than her conscience could bear. Miss Marple thanked him with her usual calm politeness, but as the door closed behind him, her thoughts gathered like slow-moving clouds. Love, she reflected, often concealed the most unlovely motives, especially when mixed with guilt. The following morning brought another small yet significant revelation. The vicar's niece, a bright girl with a sharp ear for mischief, stopped Miss Marple in the lane to recount a curious remark overheard at the church. Mrs. Bragg, while arranging flowers the morning of the colonel's death, had muttered darkly, "She'll get what's coming to her." The niece had thought little of it at the time, assuming it a quarrel among servants, but in retrospect it sounded rather more ominous. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her mind fitting this piece neatly among the growing collection. Mrs. Bragg's loyalty to the colonel had always bordered on the possessive. Jealousy, pride, and moral indignation were traits she seldom bothered to disguise. Yet such emotions could harden into something colder if given the right encouragement. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to that morning at the tower, to the candle wax, the footprints, and the air of secrecy. People, she mused silently, often warn others of what they themselves intend. As the girl departed, humming innocently, Miss Marple knew she was one step closer to the truth, though the truth, as ever, was more tangled than it first appeared. By the time twilight fell, Miss Marple sat by her parlour fire, knitting half forgotten in her lap, her thoughts weaving their own intricate pattern. She saw before her the figures of Greystone, Celia, pale and fragile, haunted by something too heavy for innocence, Arthur Jolly, driven by resentment and thwarted ambition, Mrs. Bragg, whose loyalty to the colonel had perhaps become something darker, and poor Dr. Linton, drawn unwillingly into a tangle of deceit. They were all connected by threads of guilt, some inherited, some chosen, all unravelling now in the shadow of death. The colonel's conscience had led him to amend his will. That act, rather than redemption, might well have provoked ruin. Jealousy, greed, and fear, Miss Marple reflected, were the three most reliable companions of crime. Yet she hesitated to accuse. Evil, she knew, seldom presented itself as wickedness. It came disguised as desperation, as duty, even as love. Her mind returned to the letters, the trunk, and the history they contained. The debt of Greystone, once metaphorical, had become literal, a payment extracted in poison. The question that remained was simple but terrible. Who had finally decided the account must be closed? Inspector Craddock had permitted Miss Marple a final look at the colonel's study, though he regarded it as an act of indulgence rather than necessity. She, however, approached the room with quiet purpose. Kneeling by the hearth, she examined the ashes within the grate. There had been a fire, recently and deliberate, yet not a complete one. Among the cinders, she found fragments of scorched paper, some edges too intact to have burned fully. With delicate patience, she teased them free and spread them upon the desk. The fragments revealed partial lines of writing, a signature she recognised instantly. R.G. Captain Greystone again. Yet not all the letters had been destroyed, only those that bore his initials. The others, of no significance to guilt or innocence, remained untouched. Someone had chosen carefully what to erase and what to leave. Miss Marple folded the charred pieces with care. Fire, she thought, was the most convenient accomplice to remorse, yet even fire left its betrayals. What was intended as destruction had become confession instead. By week's end, gossip in St. Mary Mead had reached its inevitable crescendo. Each villager claimed private knowledge of the affair at Greystone, though their versions differed wildly. Yet amid the chatter, Miss Marple detected patterns, fragments of truth hidden among embroidery. She heard that Celia Harwood had received several unsigned notes warning her to confess before it is too late. Others insisted that Arthur Jolly had boasted of knowing something that could hang a lady. Beneath the pettiness of talk lay something heavier, the scent of blackmail. Miss Marple reflected that gossip, like tapestry, was composed of many threads, each insignificant alone but together forming an image, one that was never entirely faithful yet seldom wholly false. She began to see how every person in that house had bartered silence for safety. Secrets, she thought, were the true currency of small communities. They circulated endlessly, growing more valuable and more dangerous as with every whisper. Somewhere amid those whispers lay the motive strong enough to kill. The final clue arrived not through investigation, but through the ordinary rhythm of village life. One morning the vicarage maid brought Miss Marple an envelope, unmarked and without address. Inside lay a single half of a burnt photograph. It showed a young soldier, Captain Raymond Greystone, standing beside a woman whose features, though blurred by age and flame, were unmistakably those of Celia Harwood. Miss Marple studied it in silence. It was not resemblance alone, but connection that struck her. Celia's hidden fear, the Colonel's remorse, the strange phrase, the debt of Greystone, all converged at last into something painfully clear. The past had not haunted the present by accident. It had lived on, disguised as respectability. The photograph, once whole, had been torn in two, like the truth itself. Folding it carefully, Miss Marple felt the faint chill of certainty. Celia's secret, she realised, was not simply guilt, but inheritance. And someone, somewhere, had decided that the past should remain unrecognised, even if it meant another death. The drawing room at Greystone was unusually quiet that afternoon. Miss Marple, seated by the fire with her customary serenity, had requested the presence of every remaining member of the household for tea. Her voice, soft but insistent, carried the authority of one accustomed to being gently obeyed. The Colonel's death had left a residue of strain that clung to the house like mist, and now all eyes were upon her. Celia pale and anxious, Dr. Linton grave, Arthur Jolly sullen, and Mrs. Bragg standing stiffly near the door, her hands folded with an air of defiance. The teapot steamed faintly between them, a civilized barrier against the mounting tension. Miss Marple poured with delicate precision, her manner that of a hostess rather than an investigator. Yet beneath the ritual calm there was the unmistakable sense that truth itself had been invited to tea, and that no one present would leave entirely unscathed. Her eyes rested, kind but unyielding, upon each face in turn. "I think," she began gently, "we have allowed the shadow of Greystone to grow darker than it deserves. Perhaps before the day is out, we may see how very ordinary, and how very human, this tragedy truly is." Miss Marple's words seemed to hang in the air like a benediction and a warning combined. She spoke quietly, almost conversationally, of the so-called curse of Greystone, that vague terror whispered through the village and repeated with relish by the superstitious. "There is no curse," she said, her tone almost indulgent, "except the kind men and women create for themselves." Her calm gaze swept across the group. "It is not the dead who trouble us, but the living who cannot forget them." A faint rustle disturbed the stillness as Celia's gloved hand moved nervously upon her lap. "The ghostly lights in the tower," Miss Marple continued, "the anonymous letters, the talk of debts unpaid, all these were not born of mystery but of guilt. Someone wished the past to seem supernatural because it was in fact painfully real." Her needles lay idle upon the table beside her, forgotten. "Superstition," she concluded softly, "has been a very useful veil, one that hid resentment, blackmail, and revenge." Her eyes, bright with unspoken knowledge, came to rest upon Celia Harwood. "And now, perhaps, we may lift it, and look at what truly lies beneath." The silence that followed was complete. Celia Harwood's face drained of colour, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Miss Marple's expression did not waver. Her voice, when it resumed, was steady and kind, almost maternal. "You see, my dear," she said gently, There was never a Mrs. Harwood before you, and yet there was once a Miss Greystone. The name fell like a stone into still water. You are Captain Raymond Greystone's daughter. Born beyond marriage, yes, but his nonetheless. The likeness is plain to anyone who has eyes to look. The same features, the same quickness of spirit. Though, I dare say, the burden of your father's shame has rested more heavily upon you than you ever confessed. Celia's trembling hands clutched at the handkerchief in her lap, her composure dissolving as Miss Marple continued. You changed your name, of course. A sensible precaution for a woman who wished to return unseen to the place of her father's ruin. I think, Miss Marple added quietly, you believed you could reclaim more than property. You hoped to redeem a name, and perhaps, in your own way, to avenge it. Celia's eyes met hers then, wide with recognition and despair, as though the truth had at last spoken aloud the thing she could no longer deny. Miss Marple's voice, though still gentle, held now the clarity of judgment. Your marriage to Colonel Harwood, she said, was never born of love, not truly. You married him under a false name to stand where your father had fallen. The man who ruined Captain Greystone now dined in the house that once bore his victim's name. You meant to make him see, to live daily beneath the roof his deceit had built, and to know that you, the child of his betrayal, held sway over him. Celia's head bowed. Her hand trembled so violently that her teacup rattled against its saucer. But revenge, Miss Marple went on softly, is a poor foundation for any household. You discovered too late that guilt breeds fear, and fear, my dear, leads to folly. You meant only to frighten him, perhaps to force confession, but others saw opportunity in your distress. The poison that killed him was not your doing, though your secrecy made it seem so. The words hung in the air like absolution and accusation both. Across the room, Mrs. Bragg's lips tightened, and Arthur Jolly's eyes shifted uneasily. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on each of them before returning to Celia. Vengeance, she concluded quietly, never restores the past. It merely imitates its cruelty. Miss Marple's voice remained quiet, but each word carried the weight of unassailable reason. The truth, my dear Mrs. Harwood, she said gently, is rather less dreadful than it first appears. You did not mean to kill your husband. You meant to frighten him. There was a collective intake of breath, and even Celia herself seemed paralyzed by the calm certainty of the statement. You had learned, Miss Marple continued, that the man you married was the same who ruined your father. I think you hoped confession might free him, and yourself, from that old debt. But fear, as it so often does, became your chosen weapon. You placed the poison not in his coffee but in a bottle meant for his tonic, intending to warn him before it was used. Yet pride held you silent, and fate, as it often does, arranged a crueler outcome. You never imagined, of course, that someone else would discover your plan. Miss Marple's eyes, mild but penetrating, rested upon Celia's pale face. You were foolish, yes, but not wicked. Fear and pride are dreadful counsellors, and you had both for company. Celia bowed her head, tears sliding quietly down her cheek. No, said Miss Marple softly, you did not kill him, but another did, one who feared exposure more than pity. The name needed no utterance. It hung unspoken between them. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the young man standing near the hearth. Arthur Jolly, she said at last, her tone neither accusatory nor kind, knew far more than he should. He found the bottle in the study the night before the Colonel's death. He recognized it for what it was, not proof of murder, but the promise of scandal. And scandal, my dear Inspector, can be worth money in the right hands. Arthur's lips parted as if to protest, but Miss Marple went on implacably. You saw an opportunity. You switched the cups that morning, placing the poison in the Colonel's coffee and leaving the harmless one before his wife. You hoped suspicion would fall upon her, and that in her distress she would pay dearly for your silence. It was greed, not hatred, that moved you. And like so many who trade in deceit, you miscalculated. You forgot that guilt is a chain. It binds not only those who deserve it, but those who try to profit from it. Arthur's colour drained as Miss Marple's quiet words closed around him like a noose. Your plan, she finished, was clever enough for a fool, and that is what you have proved to be. A murmur passed through the room, as Miss Marple's calm exposition deepened into something colder, more inexorable. "It was not the Colonel's death alone," she continued. "That marked your guilt, Mr. Jolly. Your father's drowning was no accident either. He had stumbled upon your deceit, perhaps saw you switch the cups, or found what you had taken from the study. A good man, your father, with a sense of right and wrong unspoiled by bitterness. He confronted you, and you silenced him, not from malice, but from panic. The rest followed naturally. You claimed the pond had claimed him, and the village believed it, as villagers do." Her voice softened, not with mercy, but pity. "You see, guilt is like the water that took your father. It draws a man under little by little. First the conscience, then the courage, and finally the reason." Arthur's face had turned a ghastly white. His hands clenched at his sides, trembling not with remorse but the fear of a man already condemned. "2 deaths, Miss Marple said quietly, bound by one foolish heart. Yours." The silence that followed was broken only by Celia's strangled sob, the cry of a woman whose burden had shifted from guilt to grief. Miss Marple rose slowly, her eyes never leaving Arthur Jolly. The young man backed toward the doorway, his breath shallow, his defiance faltering. "You can't prove it," he whispered, though conviction had already left him. But justice, Miss Marple thought, seldom waited for proof when conscience delivered its own. Moments later he was gone, out through the open doors, his footsteps echoing across the terrace. They heard the distant rush of wind, the faint splash from the park beyond. Inspector Craddock moved instinctively, but Miss Marple's hand stopped him. "No need," she murmured softly. "The pond has taken what it was owed." When at last they reached the water's edge, the surface had already stilled. The reeds swayed gently, whispering like voices reconciled. Celia knelt upon the grass, weeping quietly. Miss Marple stood beside her, grave and composed. "It is over now," she said. "The debt of Greystone is paid, twice over." Spring came gently to St. Mary Mead, as it always did, without drama but with a quiet assurance that winter's reign was done. The air was scented with lilac and damp earth, the kind of fragrance that spoke of second chances. Miss Marple moved among her rose bushes with patient affection, trimming a stray stem here, guiding a tender shoot there. Nature, she reflected, never hurried yet accomplished everything in time. The crocuses along the garden path lifted their small faces to the morning sun, unaware of human failings or sorrow. The village itself seemed to breathe again. Laughter returned to the high street, and gossip softened from malice to curiosity. Greystone Park, though still a subject of murmured speculation, had at last fallen silent. As Miss Marple brushed the soil from her gloves, she thought how odd it was that life, despite all tragedy, always chose to bloom again. The vicar found Miss Marple in her garden one afternoon, her hands clasped loosely around a teacup, her hat tilted against the light. He spoke of forgiveness, of how swiftly people forgot sorrow when comfort returned. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Human nature, my dear vicar," she said, "is much like a garden. It requires constant tending. Left alone, the weeds of guilt and envy will overrun the gentler growths. And yet," she added softly, "there are always flowers, kindness, loyalty, courage, that persist even in poor soil." The vicar nodded, though he suspected she spoke not merely of horticulture. As he took his leave, the church bells began their slow evening chime, mellow and forgiving. Miss Marple listened for a moment before turning back to her roses. Life, she mused, never remained barren for long. Even sorrow, given time and care, might yield something beautiful. Celia Harwood left St. Mary Mead on a pale morning, her small valise carried by the station porter. No one spoke ill of her, no one quite knew what to say. She had been found innocent in law, but innocence and peace, Miss Marple thought, were seldom the same thing. Celia's face, glimpsed from the carriage window, bore neither defiance nor relief, only the calm of one who had accepted her own punishment. She was going abroad, so rumour said, to take up nursing work among the wounded and poor. It was a fitting penance, Miss Marple reflected, for a woman who had learned too late that vengeance wounds twice, once the wronged, and once the avenger. As the train whistle faded into distance, Miss Marple turned away, knowing that time would deal kindly with the girl, as it so often did with those who'd suffered enough. Greystone Park, once dark and shuttered beneath its burden of memory, found a new purpose before the year's end. By arrangement of the trustees, the estate was converted into a charitable home for convalescent soldiers, men broken not by wickedness, but by war. The villagers, who had once spoken of curses and ghosts, now spoke of gratitude and pride. The North Tower, long sealed from light, stood open once more, its windows catching the morning sun like forgiveness itself. The ivy on the old stone walls was pruned but not removed, as though the house were learning to live with its scars rather than erase them. Miss Marple visited once quietly, and noted how laughter now echoed where silence had brooded. A house, she thought, is rather like a heart. It is never ruined by sorrow, only by the refusal to let the light in again. In the tranquil solitude of her sitting room, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting idle in her lap. The case of Greystone had left no bitterness in her mind, only a mild sadness for the frailty of human judgment. She reflected that vengeance, so often mistaken for justice, merely repeated old wrongs in different hands. It offered satisfaction, but never renewal. True peace, she thought, came not from punishment, but from understanding, the quiet acceptance that people erred less from malice than from fear, vanity, or pain. The world was seldom divided between good and evil. It was merely composed of many shades of loneliness. Outside, the garden murmured with life. Bees in the primroses, a blackbird's call, the faint rustle of spring wind. Miss Marple listened, content in the knowledge that truth, when patiently sought, had its own rhythm, sometimes cruel, but always inevitable. She thought of Celia, of her father, of the long circle of guilt that had finally closed. It comforted her to know that nature at least forgave everything. As afternoon mellowed into golden light, Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea and settled by the window. Her roses gleamed beyond the glass, a riot of colour and promise. She regarded them with affection, not pride, as one might regard old friends who had survived both frost and neglect. The cup in her hand felt warm and certain, an anchor to the present after all the shadows of the past. She recalled the phrase whispered so often in the village, the debt of Greystone. Debts, she mused, were rarely financial. Most were paid in silence, through remorse, endurance, or love. The world had a way of balancing itself, not by law or fortune, but by truth emerging when it must. The church bells rang softly across the fields, and she smiled, that small knowing smile of hers that held both melancholy and peace. After all, she murmured to no one in particular, truth, like spring, always finds its way back. And with that she returned to her knitting, while the scent of roses drifted through the open window, tender and forgiving as the evening itself. There's something quietly haunting about what happened at Greystone Park, isn't there? A place once burdened by guilt and silence finally found its redemption, not through punishment, but through understanding. Miss Marple often said that truth has a curious way of waiting, like a seed beneath the frost, ready to bloom when the time is right. In the end, Greystone was not cursed by ghosts, but by human hearts, hearts that mistook vengeance for justice and silence for peace. Yet as spring returned, forgiveness gently took root where resentment once grew, reminding us that even the darkest stories can end in light. It makes one wonder, if you were in Celia's place, burdened by a family's ruined name and face to face with the man responsible, would you have chosen forgiveness or revenge disguised as righteousness? Which path, do you think, truly heals the past? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments below what you believe Celia should have done, and whether you think justice was truly served at Greystone Park. Your insights always make these stories feel alive again, and I read every single one of them. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, quiet, human, and full of secrets beneath the surface. And do share it with someone who loves classic mysteries, perhaps over a pot of tea, just as Miss Marple herself would have liked.